looking down from the top, we see the centerpiece of this sacred building, and that is the Ark of the Covenant. It represents the throne of God and the place where God meets mankind and where the covenant serves as the mediator between God and humans. The idea of a portable shrine, of course, has been written about in other Mormon places, but is also a well-known phenomenon in the ancient world. And here's one from Egypt where we see a portable shrine that takes the image of the god back and forth. And once again, one of our ideas was that this sacred space in antiquity is always mediated by priesthood, those who are called to mediate between God and man. The primary thing that was done at these places was sacrifice. Sacrifice is something, the blood sacrifice at least, is a little unfamiliar to us. But sacrifice as the concept is something very familiar to us as Latter-day Saints, as a form of worship of our God. Solomon's Temple from 968 to 586. For about 400 years, an actual building stood on Mount Moriah. This building then serves as the main idea of our book that overshadows all of the rest of history to the present day, this idea of Solomon's Temple. We don't think there's a single artifact remaining from this building, and yet this powerful idea continues to influence three great world religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Here's a picture of Jerusalem at the time of Solomon. You're familiar with that, the temple on the top of the hill facing towards the east, towards the Mount of Olives, designed to greet God or the Messiah when he returns at the end of time from the east, and also facing the rising sun there. You'll see the palace down there about the middle of our picture. Solomon's Temple, as you'll see from one of the drawings in our book, was a greatly expanded, at least in terms of dimensions, of the symbols of the tabernacle. And we have these large cherubim here. We had the 10 movable fonts of water inside. We had the great basin outside on top of the 12 oxen that we're familiar with as Latter-day Saints, and we see the great altar in front. Many aspects of this temple, and we actually have to reconstruct this temple largely by analogy with other Near Eastern manifestations of these symbols, since we only have literary kinds of descriptions of these objects. But here we have living water, we have trees, we have cherubim, we have incense altars here. If you look on the upper left hand, you'll see the two columns, a Canaanite view of these two columns that we're familiar with in the temple. We see an incense altar, we see an ivory cherub, we see incense shovels, and we see the movable basins that were there. And once again, we're faced with this interesting issue about cultural kinds of borrowings that might have occurred here versus the revelation that we come to expect with the building of temples. There are interesting temples besides Solomon's Temple in ancient Israel. One at Dan, and if you ever get a chance to go to the Holy Land, this is the temple. You can actually stand right on the high place there. This was the Temple of Dan. According to the biblical writers, it was an apostate temple where the golden bulls were. It has the same kind of architecture that we're familiar with in the sacred space at the temple. We have a temple to Jehovah, the Lord God of Israel, at Arad, which shows a basic form of the tripartite structure of Solomon's temple. And these appear to us to have been authorized temples to Jehovah before the time of Josiah, who then overthrew many of these sacred places. And you can see here we have the archaeological remains there. So you can actually visit some of these sacred places. Still has the great altar in front, has the stairs moving up into the holy place and up into the most holy place. And you can go stand in these places and observe this sacred space. Baal and Asherah invade our temples in ancient Israel. And the meaning of these symbols in the temple is not fully understood, but we're familiar with these as representing idolatry. And Professor Mendenhall taught us at the University of Michigan that idolatry is when a culture, even a religious culture, puts any interest above God or their fellow men. And he actually taught us that lots of symbols in the temple, maybe even authorized symbols, could have become parts of idolatrous worship. And there's great insight into studying what idolatry means, both in terms of symbols and in terms of our individual and personal lives. You're familiar with Josiah. Josiah cleansed the temple. He threw out all of these pagan things, and there has been now a movement within Latter-day Saint scholarship to acknowledge the work of one Margaret Barker. And Margaret Barker suggests to us that many of the things that Josiah threw out of the temple were in fact part of the ancient old, scholars would call it Yahwism, or the ancient worship of Jehovah. And of course, there remains a lot of work to be done on that. But she's sort of taking a third position in between Nibley and Mendenhall as to the meaning of lots of these symbols that we find in the Bible. Ezekiel. Ezekiel had this marvelous vision of God on his throne. And I guess Ezekiel really contributes three things to our discussion. First of all, he sees God on his movable throne, a movable throne that has come from heaven and has met Ezekiel in Babylon on the river Kebar. Ezekiel also teaches us that the temple will be restored. It will be restored in the future. And Ezekiel teaches us that one can enjoy the presence of God through vision, not being in Jerusalem, which is the basis of lots of the mysticism, both in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. As you know, in 586, the temple was destroyed. Zerubbabel's temple took its place for about 500 years. And then it was replaced by Herod's temple, a temple that we're very interested in because, of course, this is the temple at the time of Jesus. Herod the great builder, reestablished this sacred space on the mount there and reinstituted the practice of religion on a grand scale here. Zerubbabel's temple was somewhat less than Solomon's temple. This was a great building in the ancient world, and Herod the Great was a great builder, and this was an acknowledged achievement. One of Herod's greatest achievements in his life was that he sponsored the Olympics one year, all by himself. So when they say Herod the Great, they certainly did mean he was great. But this was one of his great contributions to our idea of Solomon's temple. You're familiar with maybe some of the remains of this building. We still do have a sign that warned anyone from crossing the line from the court of the Gentiles into the courts where Israelites could go, and where he would be responsible for his or her death. Of course, there's a great debate in scholarship. One that we won't go into here is how would one know if one was a member of the covenant at this gate? And some people have actually suggested circumcision check, which of course is probably something that the church will probably just do with barcodes nowadays. Maybe I didn't say that right. Dead Sea Scrolls. The people in the desert thought that the temple in Jerusalem was apostate. And there they created a temple scroll, and the temple scroll talked about a modern manifestation of the temple that would come in the future time to be built before the coming of the Messiah. But maybe more importantly than that, the Dead Sea Scroll people considered themselves as a community to be the temple itself, that this community would serve as the body of the presence of God. An idea that was actually picked up later by the Christians. 70 AD, of course, Titus destroys the temple. We, of course, are interested in how this temple survives in Judaism, and there's 6 simple ways that we can do this. Number one, and we'll just go through these quickly. Number one, that from the very beginning, the Jews had the idea of the rebuilding of the temple. And this is the coin of Bar Kokhba in 135, which had a picture of the temple on it. Bar Kokhba said, 70 years are up, it's time to rebuild the temple. We found this picture, and this is a marvelous, marvelous picture. On the left, you will see a commemorative plate from Rome that commemorated Herod's temple. And it's right next door to a commemorative plate that was built at the time of the Nauvoo temple. And that deserves a great article somewhere. Commemorative plates. Probably somebody will do that and start a business. But you see this marvelous way of keeping the memory of the temple, even on plates. Pilgrimage. Jews initially made pilgrimage to the Temple Mount. We still have inscriptions in Jerusalem of the pilgrims. And we still see this manifested at the Western Wall, where they go to pray as close as they could to God. Number 3, the temple remains in Judaism in memory, both in writings and in art. And people like Maimonides added to the already quite large collections of writings in the Oral Law, or the Mishnah and the Talmud, that recalled for the Jews the exact way the temple had to be, the temple worship had to be carried forth. You can see the pictures here of the temple implements. You will see the story of the tabernacle in an illuminated manuscript. And you can see this marvelous Jewish picture of the Messiah coming to Jerusalem on his donkey. You don't often see this in Judaism. You see this, of course, a lot in Christianity. The temple survived, at least in the synagogue, in terms of synagogues being oriented towards the